Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Purple Way podcast. My name is Paris, and today I'm speaking to Dr. Paul McCarthy. Paul, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Amazing. Paul, how did you get into sports psychology, and what do you find fascinating about it?
Yeah, I suppose I had a slightly different journey in the sense that I began with an undergraduate in sports science, but I also completed psychology as well. And part of the sports science was about understanding more of psychology in sport and psychology through sport.
Mhm.
And from there, that whet my appetite for the next stage, which led me on to a master's degree and eventually to a PhD.
And can we briefly talk as well about like the role of sports psychotherapy and like what is it exactly that a sports therapist do?
Yeah, well, I suppose there are different terms that are used, and by definition, in the UK, we are sport and exercise psychologists or sports psychologists, which is the protected title. Sports psychologists are typically working on two main aims. One is performance, one is well-being, and the two cross over more than we probably recognize. And the goal for most athletes, I guess, is to see changes mainly in performance, but it can also be about the enjoyment that they get from playing and performing. And the extent to which they get the opportunity to do that relies on several factors. And psychologists are trained to be able to bridge the gap between what is personal and what is professional.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. In your TEDx speech in Glasgow that you gave, you talk about the book Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Bach, and kind of inspired me to ask you, what does believing in yourself mean to you, and also how can we interpret it? And maybe if we can give a brief as well, kind of like description of the book, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. And, it's a book that I would recommend anyone to read for their own interpretation of the text.
Hmm.
And what I got from it, and in terms of recommendations to others, is about somebody finding out about themselves. So they're in search of their own meaning. And this example was of a seagull pursuing flying as fast as he could fly. And finding that out was what his life's work became. And what it means for others is something similar, that we are in pursuit of something that is intrinsically valuable to us. But beyond that, of course, you have the trappings that are attached to achievement, but its fundamental understanding and value is about what it gives to the person.
Hmm.
And when we're talking about a belief in oneself, if we are thinking about from our basics of opinions, attitudes, values, and beliefs, if we think about it like a hierarchy, we have developed a certain level of belief about ourselves, about others, about the world, based on our experiences, social, cultural, economic, political, and so on, that has shaped who we are. And our beliefs will be different from others.
Hmm.
And to believe in ourselves more specifically is about what we believe to be right and true about us. And some may have distortions, and some of those distortions can be changed, challenged, and reinterpreted. So
Yeah.
the notion that we can believe what we wish is true.
Yeah. And would you say is the difference between self confidence and self esteem?
Yeah. Like, if we go to the theory, self-esteem is a multifaceted construct. It means that we have competence in different areas, and it might be scholastic or physical or social. So our self-esteem is a global term that captures all of those facets underneath.
Hmm.
Self-confidence is what we would say is a colloquial term, a term that most people would understand. But in the literature, we would talk about self-efficacy. And self
Yeah.
efficacy is about its specificity in terms of strength, level, and generality. What that means is that as sports psychologists, we are working with very specific elements of a person's belief in their ability to do something. And those change according to the task, or it might change according to competition, and various other factors that we would look at within the environment. So, as sports psychologists, at least in our own work and how we communicate with each other, it's much more about the specificity and the precision in terms of the terms we're using and how theory applies to practice, how practice, as we learn, applies back to theory. And we are always at one level trying to be within our head, understanding, analyzing, reflecting. But when we're working with athletes, it's very much more about the heart of forming relationships, developing a connection, and building a therapeutic support for the client over the length of time you're working with them. So there is a lot of
Yeah.
head and heart and a bit of tug between the two.
Yeah. But then would you say, is it more important to build? So I guess like when it comes to sports, right? Like, is confidence more important, or the overall self-esteem of the person, of the athlete, is more important to kind of like develop from a sports,
Yeah.
psychotherapist perspective?
Yeah. So if we look at self esteem, like I was mentioning earlier, it is a global construct. So it has many facets, there are different parts. And we might talk about one's physical competence and
Hmm.
one's ability to play sport, etc. So their athletic competence. Now, those
Yeah.
are specific facets. Somebody may not be so good scholastically, school might be difficult for them, but they may be very
Hmm.
good at golf. So we have facets within our life that draw us in more and facets that we perhaps don't feel so confident about. So
Hmm. Hmm.
confidence is our belief in our ability to do something, whereas with
Yeah.
self-esteem, it's a global construct. It's the totality of ourselves. And there's plenty of debate about that as well. But in terms of what we're trying to do as working, practicing psychologists is dealing with the specificity of what's presented.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do have three scenarios, or kind of like three situations, and I would like to kind of like break them down one by one, right? So, one perspective is the perspective that I'm an athlete or a high achiever, but I'm always hungry for more. I want more success. I want to become better. And I would like to ask you, is it important to take a step back and take in the success someone has achieved? So basically, the perspective in this scenario is that, someone is never satisfied with where they are and they always want more. How would you kind of apply that, in sports psychology, and what would you recommend for that person?
Yeah. Well, a lot of the work that we would do one to one with an athlete is exploring who they are. And we would look typically at what the presenting issue might be. So, something like that, say somebody might be feeling the winning is never enough, I need more, and so on. And part of that looks at the predisposing issues. So, what within their childhood, young adulthood, has created the person that we see sitting before us. And part of that is a complicated, and it's a history that is perhaps less well understood to the athlete, but much more detailed for psychologists. And what I mean
Mm,
by that is an athlete might describe their childhood, their adolescence, their young adulthood, and what they're seeing is a description of what life was like for them.
mhm,
But for a psychologist, there are lots of different facets within that story that tell us about them. It might tell us about their attachment. It might tell us about how they relate to others. It might tell us about the sources of belief in their lives. And all of those factors are shaped by their experiences, the experiences of those around them, the world in which they are living. And because those are changing over time, each person will have a unique sense of who they are, what their life is like, what it is they want. But they may not necessarily understand those foundational elements within their need for or their drive to succeed.
mhm,
And we might go down, say, for example, Maslow's hierarchy of needs as an initial description, and there are other ways to go with that, or we might look across developmental models. But essentially, what you're doing is helping somebody to see what their basic needs are and what their psychological needs are. And those psychological needs mean that, say, for example, sport or competition. Now, that's not necessarily a need that we have, a psychological need. However, our need to belong and our need for esteem might be
mhm.
best represented or achieved through sport. We could be on
Yeah.
stage, we could be playing music, we could be on television. But sport offers many people that opportunity to express themselves and meet those psychological needs. And they're just psychological needs. There may be others as well in terms of
Yeah.
social needs and belonging and so on. Mhm.
But like, and I get where you're coming from, that like, for example, if someone is constantly hungry for success, it's not like what we see right now. It is something that comes from their childhood, how they grew up, and is part of a bigger picture, which is their childhood and how they grew up, right? How would you go about, like, is it good to be hungry for success? And how would you kind of tell this person that, yes, want more success, but then at the same time, look back and see what you have already achieved?
Yeah.
Or would you not do
Yeah.
that?
Well, you know, the way a psychologist works really is about trying to understand what is happening, you know, the thoughts, the feelings, the responses, the behaviors of the other person. It's much less about us, it's much less about our direction, our sense of direction. It is more about what is going on for the athlete. And when I refer to the childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, all I'm saying about those is they are shaping in some way. And only through our experiences do our notion of what is happening to us change. So we might find that we have very little interest in playing sport, but then at 12 years old, somebody throws a rugby ball. And next thing there is a, you know, from there, a growth and development. And we've seen that in lots of different sports. It may be
Mhm.
that later on in somebody's career, or perhaps they are not physically active and they start running one day and marathon running becomes their thing. So it's not like we are looking at, you know, childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood as fixed entities. It's more
Mhm.
about the unveiling of ourselves. And most people are in search of meaning. And what I mean
Yeah.
by that is, you know, I think they often use the term of masochism in search of meaning when people are doing, you know, rowing the Atlantic or, you know, running across the world or whatever it might be, because we
Yeah.
are finding out about ourselves, which is probably what, you know, life is all about. And as we
Yeah.
hear most people describe, they only find out about themselves when they are put in situations that they didn't expect.
Yeah. 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 I think the more you put yourself out there, and you do different hobbies, or like, you experience new things, that's the more you learn about yourself. I do agree with you. And I understand also your perspective. Um, in a second scenario, let's say, for example, someone is a parent and they see their athletic, son or daughter struggle to keep up with the rest of the team. What kind of conversation would you have with the parent? And again, the approach or the perspective I'm coming from is on the topic of performance for young kids. Um, and we can take two sides. One side is the kid that, performs amazing, right? So it has like a natural talent, and the kid that potentially is struggling, right? If you are a parent and you see your kids on those two sides, right? What is the kind of the conversation that you would have with them when it comes to kind of the kid's perspective on performance?
Yeah. And there's a lot to unpack in these scenarios
Yeah.
because, you know, parents, their own personal history, their own experience in sport, their current circumstances in their lives, if we put that to one side and we look at the child on the other in terms of
Mm.
their age and stage, all of these factors interplay. And what I mean by that is that it's very difficult for a lot of people to understand what is me and mine and what is the other person's. And with a lot of parents, that's understandable. They're not really sure, based on their own experience, their view of life, their view of themselves and others, about how to be and what sense to make of things. And we see a lot, not just it could be in coaching, teaching, parenting, etc. There's a lot of alarm and judgment, but it is
Mm.
coming maybe from the adult side. And what a lot of children are looking for is compassion and understanding.
Mm.
And compassion and understanding is a chance for the child to look at themselves in a way that says, I'm okay. Let me figure
Yeah.
myself out. And these comparisons and standards are so inherent in our society that it's very difficult to know, am I judging because of my experience and my childhood, my young adulthood, etc.? Or am I looking at the child for how the child sees themselves, others, and the world around them? And we're trying to make that separation because who knows what's within the child's capacity given the environment, the support, and the connection that they need. And
Yeah.
sport is often just, I don't want to say just a display, but it is a display for connection. Is, somebody scores a goal, they'll, hit a drive in golf, smash in tennis, and it's mum, dad, did you see what I just did there? And
Yeah.
these are part of our development. But as we get older, we still want people to see us, to recognize us, to value us, and to know that we are worthwhile. And that need for success, however we define it, is something that we need to peel apart slowly with parents and children, and often separately, so that there is time with the parent and time with the child. And what we find a lot of is that when the parents reflect on their own thoughts, feelings, and so on, that there's much less wrong with the child, if we use that language. There's much less going on with them. And
Yeah.
the notion of ability and development, these are difficult constructs for a child because they don't know what their ability is. Everything's unfolding for them. They're doing
Mhm.
what they're doing in the sense that they're doing it. And most of the time, what they're looking for is guidance, but guidance in a way that doesn't appear like guidance. And that's a really difficult thing to do. That takes a real skill.
Yeah, and I guess like what you're saying with guidance, it's very difficult for a parent when they have their own life, their full-time job, they're trying to raise their kids,
Mm,
and then send their kids to sports or like learn like a musical instrument, whatever they may want, and on top of that also be a guide for their kid to to teach it well. And what you said, I really like, that like sports is about also connection and compassion. It's not like, and especially for a kid, right? Sign them up to play football, not because like you're expecting your kid to be, the next Cristiano Ronaldo or Messi, but to for the connection and the social skills, right?
yeah. Yeah, and for most people, sport is a pastime. It may go on to be
Mm,
more than that, but for a lot of people, that's what it is. And
yeah.
that's not to take away anyone's dream or to diminish their direction of travel. It's more about saying, well, this experience in my life, can I find out who I am, how I respond to things, what I'm all about? And it's often through persistence, which is in itself a measure of confidence. Persistence is about, what about me am I learning today? And as I have a
Mm,
difficult conversation, dropped from a team, an injury, deselection, all of the things that happen to people. And throughout the history of sport, there's lots of examples of these. What they are telling somebody is they're giving information. They're not giving directions. They're not saying now it's time to give up. It's just information. What they wish
yeah.
to do with it is up to them. And in the right environment, there is always a way forward.
Yeah. That's interesting. And then a last scenario is from the perspective of a coach or like a manager, right? Let's say, for example, a coach has a demotivated team. It's a new coach, for example, and the team is not performing well. And what I want to ask here is like, how can a coach inspire and motivate their team to perform well? What is the fundamental shift? What's the fundamentals to shift the momentum
Yeah.
of
So
their team?
yeah, and one thing I'd like to say here, and perhaps this is the boring stuff, but whenever there's a presentation, it with an athlete, a parent, a team, a coach, we are trying to form an assessment. So we go through several stages, but it's assessment, formulation or
Mhm.
planning, intervention, evaluation, and communication is the last step. But any psychotherapeutic work with clients follows those stages. So when we're trying to make an assessment about a coach, a team, a squad, the first thing we need to do is make an assessment. Now, the coach will have
Mhm.
their view and the players will have their views, but the psychologists who's observing will also have a view. So to collate all of that information means we can come together with a better formulation and a formulation
Mm.
plan about how to intervene. And then the intervention follows and we make changes, etc. But if we're not dealing with constructs, items that we can address, that we can define and operationalize, it's very hard to do good work. So
Okay.
fundamentally, assessment allows us to be able to do the next steps. And that might take a little bit of time in observation over a week or two in a club. And we might watch teams on in performance. We might watch them in training around the training ground, etc. Just taking rugby or soccer as an example. But that's the process. So the global intervention of make the team better or help them to perform is a little bit of a misnomer because it's not specifically dealing with the item that needs addressing and that is possible to intervene upon. And from
Yeah.
there, we can do good work. And it might be that what the coach identifies, what the psychologist sees, and what the players respond to is congregating around the same thing that we can operationalize, we can put it into action. But that's what a psychologist does. And we
Yeah.
not always see that in the media, but a trained psychologist will go along those routes.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting because and I'm trying to understand as well, kind of unravel what you said, right? Or if I understand correctly, what you mean is that like when a team is not performing well, what we have to do first is assess and understand why they're not performing well. And as you're saying, we do that by assessing the team. Would that be like, okay, so let's say we can take any example that you're familiar with, but like what would an assessment be like what has been an example that you have
Yeah.
gone into a team or something. um yeah, how does that
Yeah.
assessment look like?
So an assessment will typically be three parts. It's a method of triangulation. So we would
Okay.
begin often with observation. So we would observe the
Mhm.
people, just say we're taking a football team and we'll observe them training and in competition. We'll observe them maybe around the training ground. We look at social interaction. We can look at it at a macro level. So what are the big
Mhm.
things? And at a micro level, what are individual? But we will
Mhm.
also speak to coaches. We'll speak to backroom staff. We'll speak to the players themselves. So we are moving from observation to interview. And then we're also looking at a formal assessment where it's possible to do that. And in my experience, coaches, players, backup staff are always willing to understand a little bit more about themselves. So if we're using psychometric assessments, they're always keen to find out a little bit about themselves. Oh, that's me. I
Yeah.
didn't know that about me. So we would be able to do that in a way that, over a period of a few weeks gets to really understand what's going on. Because by definition, we would need to know what it is we're working with. And in psychology, we will talk about constructs, things that are in our head, but they don't appear physically. And that could be about commitment, it could be about motivation, confidence. So we're taking
Mhm.
constructs and making them concrete from what's something abstract in our head to something concrete on paper. So we can start to define it, operationalize it, and see it in action. So, for example, if we were looking at an item like communication, we would need to know what facet of communication are we talking about. And because
Mhm.
communication is an outcome, it's also a process, but it is an outcome. When we
Mhm.
communicate, we need to be able to understand whether somebody is taking our message as it was intended. That could be the basis for some opening work, but that's the process we follow through. So it's a lot of, I would say, disciplined work on the ground to be able to collate all of that information, make sense of it, and put it into a workable project so the change can be identified, recorded, and tracked over time. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So you said first is observation, then interview, and would the third one be kind of creating the plan and tracking it.
Yeah, so the third one would be in psychometric instruments. So a psychometric instrument would be something that measures, say, athletic strain, levels of the
Hmm.
stress,
Hmm.
motivation, and so on. They're the constructs. And
Okay.
so, in a way, all of this stuff is kind of happening in parallel to the work that's going on. So the players are playing and the coaches are coaching. The psychologist is doing a lot of work behind the scenes, but it doesn't appear like they are. So observation might look like somebody standing there, but there's a lot more detail to that. Imagine if you
Yeah.
are, reasonably well acquainted with body language, or what we would call nonverbal communication. Then our
Mhm.
nonverbal communication is telling us a lot about the other person that they may not know about themselves. So it is at that level. So there is a lot of work that's happening, I suppose, in the mind and on the paper that the psychologist is using. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think it's like a silent kind of work that a psychologist does. Like, in the surface, as you say, he may be just staring the players or like just looking them, observing them. But like, on the background in the mind, it's like, okay, this is what's happening, like all the, nonverbal communication, as you say. Yeah, 100%. This is maybe a reiteration of the three scenarios, but do you approach your clients in the same way, or do you have a different approach when it comes to the athlete, to the parent, to the coach?
Yeah. So most psychologists and who are receiving their, maybe they're going through their training or they have graduated, they have learned what are called therapeutic modalities. They're ways of working therapeutically with a client. And there are things like a person-centered approach, cognitive behavior therapy, rational emotive behavior therapy, and so on. And most psychologists that are trained now will have developed skills and abilities within at least one of those, two plus, and they may have received further training. So they have a way of working. Say, for example, if they're working from a cognitive behavioral therapy approach, what they are doing is they will form a way of working with a client. So when the client comes for the initial session, there will be an exploration of what the client is presenting. But there may also be follow ups in terms of psychometric instruments or observation. So
Mhm.
each time, everybody in a way is getting the same treatment, but the way in which it
Mhm.
works with the client will differ based on what they're presenting. And it really does depend on what the client is presenting. However, behind that, let's just say it's an 18-year-old gymnast or a 28-year-old golfer, depending on developmental ages and stages, part of where they are in their career, the issues that they are presenting, all of those are intersecting in a way unique to the person. So we need to
Yeah.
understand, what sense does this make to the person? So, in a cognitive behavior therapy approach, we will be looking at thoughts, feelings, physical responses in the body, and their behavior in relation to the environment which they're in. So, the things that they are bringing, we'll start to put those pieces together. And a lot of people who do work, if they're advanced as psychologists, will have what's called an integrated approach. So they may be using more than one way of working. So they may have a base and a person centered approach, and they may use what they know from CBT or REBT. So you have an assimilated, integrated approach, which is a fancy construction for how people work as they develop, gain experience. They have a way of working, but their experience changes how their work is done. So a lot
Yeah.
of it just depends on what's being presented by the client.
Yeah, I see. No, that's interesting. So you use the framework, let's say it is CBT, but then how you kind of like, maybe communicate with every client is different. And as you say, because
Yeah,
it depends also at the level of their career they are, like you would approach them differently.
that's right. And what we're trying to
Yeah.
understand there is that the model does the work for us, or we use the
Mm.
model to do the work. So we trust the model to do the work. And
Yeah.
we are following processes within there. And CBT has specific process, person-centered therapy or EBT will have specific processes in there. And all of this kind of lies behind. Somebody may feel like they're having a conversation, that somebody's asking
Hmm.
questions and they're asking for clarification and so on. But there's a lot of work that goes in to be good at doing those pieces, really an awful lot of work, which requires
Yeah.
supervision and a lot of reflective practice and our own personal therapy to be good at what we're doing.
No, 100%. Yeah. In a way, I'm only now kind of realizing, or I become more aware of the job of a psychotherapist without devaluing it, right? But like, some questions can be basic, but behind those questions, because you use a framework, they can provide with a deeper understanding about
Yeah,
your client.
that's right.
That's interesting.
And, because there's divisions like psychotherapy, chartered psychologists, that might be sport and exercise, there might be psychiatrists, they're all working in the field of psychology, let's just say, but they have specific ways of working within that. And the way in which they make sense of things depends on how they've been trained, what they've experienced, how far along they are in their career. And it's why
Wow.
we probably hear in podcasts or maybe in the media how a psychologist was working with a client, but behind all of that is a set of mechanisms that allow that work to be done. So what
Yeah.
feels like a connection, a warmth, an understanding between a client and a psychologist, also behind that has a very strong theoretical depth to it. It means that somebody might be describing something, but that means something quite different to a psychologist. It doesn't mean that we're telling them, well, I'll tell you what that means. That means this. It's not about that at all. It's holding that information that may be relevant or may not, but it is understanding what is being presented by the client.
Yeah. 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 In when you say that, just to make sure, or like for my own understanding, is it what it's being presented by the client in a way that the deeper the message behind what they're just saying to you?
Yeah.
Is that what you also mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So while we have theoretical knowledge, let's just say sport and exercise theory and the theories that are within that and wider fields in psychology help us to be able to understand what might be happening for this particular client and others. Now, phenomenologically, to that client, they may see and experience the world differently to others. What we're interested in is how they see it, what it makes, what sense it makes to them, how they feel, what they've been thinking about. And there's a
Yeah.
uniqueness there, part of which may be shared, but part of which may be unique to that person, which is why a lot of the work is based on a one-to-one support network that we are trying to understand the client's needs, work with them to address them, and allow the person to regain their independence and go back doing what they wanted to do to the best of their ability.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Um, you said something again that on your TEDx talk that I caught and I really liked. The way you set your standards becomes the cause of your disappointment and anger later.
Yeah,
What is the difference between standards and expectations?
yeah.
I have a few questions, so I will start with that one. So, what is the difference between standards and expectations?
Yeah, so we might set standards, or the standards may be set for us. And that
Mhm.
might be to play at Premier League level, you need to be at this particular standard with different facets within the game. But our expectations may be those are higher, or our expectations may not fit where we are now in terms of physical, psychological, lifestyle, etc., the different facets that make up who we are. So, what we are trying to do is manage our expectations. And what we mean by that is about what is it I need to do today or in this performance and so on that is manageable for me. So, we may
Mm,
overstretch ourselves and not know why. We may demand more of ourselves and not know why. And I could go into the reasons why we tend to do that. Unless we understand the reasons why we're setting expectations are we as we are, we would
mm.
continue to create the same challenges for ourselves.
Oh, that's interesting.
So let's just take a CBT perspective for as an example. I might believe something. I might have a core belief that I'm not good enough or I can't play to this standard. And that
Hmm.
gets triggered maybe through training or through competition. And thoughts that are floating around my head are ones that relate to that core belief at the bottom. And because of that belief I hold, I may not be able to pay attention to undertake the task at hand, to be able to put in sufficient effort because of what I believe. So we're typically talking about our automatic thoughts at the top, our
Hmm.
underlying assumptions, what we call our rules for living. And then at the
Hmm.
bottom is our core beliefs. And when we start to understand what our core beliefs are, we start to understand what our rules for living to make life predictable. And on top, what it is that pops into our head. And CBT doesn't necessarily, it's about understanding the relationship we have with our thoughts. And it's not necessarily about trying to control them. A lot of the semantics mix people up in their understanding. It's much more about taking a view of something and maybe to
Hmm.
be able to see something more reasonable or rational in that setting. A lot more to explain about that, but as a basic, that's kind of where we would
Yeah.
be working. Yeah.
No, that's beautiful because like it is kind of like a pyramid, isn't it?
It-
You know, like the core beliefs, the rules of life, and then also what we think.
yeah,
And like it's quite interesting because I think, for and correct me if I'm wrong, right? But like I think in order for someone to change their beliefs or like the assumptions that they have or their expectations and the assumptions they have about themselves, they need to go down to the core values, right? They need to dig deep
they
to
do.
understand their core values.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And part of that, in a lot of CBT work, we would spend most of our time dealing with what are our automatic thoughts. Some are positive, some are negative, or as we would say, are helpful or unhelpful. But underneath that are rules for living. So our interventions for dealing with the thoughts we have are often about trying to understand what they are, the feelings that come with them, the alternatives, a new way of seeing things. But our rules for living are the ways in which we have created predictions for our lives. And many of those
Mhm.
hypotheses haven't been tested. So we would set about behavioral experiments to test out this hypothesis, like, oh, I don't think I could play a round of golf if I didn't warm up for an hour and a half beforehand. Well, we say, well, let's
Yeah.
test that prediction and see what we find. And testing the prediction allows them to test, yeah, these rules I have for myself, some of them work, some of them don't. Eventually, we
Yeah.
get to the core beliefs, but it's often the case that working with our automatic thoughts and underlying assumptions address the core belief in itself. But yeah,
I see. Okay. Okay. I see. So you would, let's say, in a session, right, with athlete, let's say, for example, you would start from the top. You would start from the automatic, helpful or unhelpful
yeah,
thoughts that the athlete has.
yeah,
Then you will go to the rules of life and what they believe, about themselves and their abilities,
yeah,
and those two would hopefully
yeah.
change the core beliefs
Yeah,
of the person.
that's right. Now we can understand what the core belief might be, but altering it often depends upon dealing with the thoughts we have and our rules for living, those underlying assumptions that we hold, and be able to test and figure out what changes we can make in our lives. And again, I'm just presenting one element there, that's a CBT
Sure.
approach, and there are several others, but we do know from a lot of the research in other fields in psychology and outside how beneficial they are, and we see
Yeah.
change over time.
Is this is a I just came up with this question. So, but like for example, like is CBT one of the most well searched methods of
Yeah,
psychology?
it is, and
Is
there's a
that okay?
reason for that. It's popular, meaning that it is taught in more institutions, meaning that there are more people researching it. So you get what is a slightly distorted reflection of all the modalities. you see how that would
Okay,
happen. Whereas
I see.
the research going back over the last 40 or 50 years or longer actually has shown that modalities are quite similar in terms of their outcomes, but it depends on the presentation, the issue that's being presented. But they are
I
all
see.
quite similar in terms of their benefits.
I got you. And how do high expectations, going back kind of like in
Mhm.
the difference between standards and expectations,
Yeah.
how do high expectations impact someone's mental health?
Yeah. Well, again, it when we're trying to look at expectations, we need to understand what they are, again, define and operationalize because of what they might mean. My interpretation of them and somebody else could be quite different. And expectations in and of themselves are not an issue. It is about what effect they have upon the person, whether they are creating maybe a challenge state, that they feel energized to be able to address them, or perhaps they find them threatening, which means that they feel somewhat demotivated or avoidant in their search to, find out who they are, but, at the same time deal with those expectations. And there are
Yeah.
lots of facets of research out there that make it really interesting about what people do uh, with when they put their motivation and their competence together. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I know, like psychology, I think, like, of course, it's not like an hour's conversation. And especially when we're talking about expectations, that I think, like, nowadays or throughout history, I'm not sure how I can put it, but like expectations, I think, can be a topic by itself because it can go, I think, very deep.
it can, because expectations, by definition, one might say it's something that I expect to do or I expect to achieve. Now, even if I said it's something I expect to do or something I expect to achieve, there's quite a difference between those two statements. I might do
Mm,
something and not achieve it. Take, for example, goal setting. Goal setting is
yeah,
just the first part, it's setting a goal. Goal achievement is the other part. Do I achieve my goals? So while people might set goals, what they're really focused on is whether my goals lead to an achievement. And again, that's another facet of psychological research, and there's quite a depth to that as well. And it's why, I
yeah,
guess, on the one hand, we ask psychologists that are in training, going through undergrad, postgrad in training, and postgraduate as well, that we to keep reading at a depth that allows them to gain, a strong understanding about human behavior and mental activity more generally, which means that
mm,
they have a better structure for understanding what's being presented, at least for themselves. How that might work its way into a formulation and an intervention will depend upon the client and the issue.
yeah. And kind of briefly, regarding goal setting, is the best way to set goals is by breaking them down in smaller goals? Like, what can you tell us from a
Yeah.
sports,
Yes.
therapy about goals, and how can we set good goals,
Yeah.
if that makes sense?
Yeah. So there is quite a lot to goal setting to make it a
Goals.
workable structure. Now, we are, as human beings, goal directed. We're in the sense that we want to have a drink of water, go outside, do some work. We're goal directed. And
Mm,
our goal setting really is a structure to go with that. So some tasks we might say don't require or us to set goals. But what we typically know is that tasks that are over a longer duration, like finishing a degree or trying to become a professional athlete, these things aren't starting today and ending tomorrow. They're taking quite a lot of time. So we want to be able to break the goal down into manageable chunks. And then we want to be able to take facets of that skill or performance and break that down and see can we make progress. So it really is a process of setting and achieving goals, and uh, we're trying to look for the optimal challenge for us within that small little goal that we're setting. And we know
yeah,
through the research that that is what's optimizing our motivation, and it's optimizing our commitment over time. So there is a lot of work to that. In fact, I wouldn't underestimate the volume of work to set goals well. to achieve
Yeah.
them. And even if people will deny that they ever set a goal, unbeknownst to themselves, they're setting a goal. Like, say, for example, if they say, I need to go to the toilet, now they don't even need to say it, they may just go to the toilet, but in a sense, they are defining their goal, their
Yeah.
achievement, and the outcome. All of that
Yeah.
fits within there. And
Yeah.
but goal setting is stressful. It's stressful for several reasons because it takes planning, it takes reviewing, it takes the doing as well, going through that performance cycle of planning, doing, and reviewing. And inside in it as well, there's such a potential for failure. And
Sure.
failure is hard to take for a lot of people, even though fundamentally it is just information. It's not direction.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. Sorry, yeah, I don't know why I never thought about it in that way. That's interesting. Can we talk a little bit about failure, because like it's something I did not put into my kind of questions, but I think, and I don't know why I did not think about it,
Yeah.
but what can you tell us about failure, and how should we take in failure?
Yeah.
How can we accept it,
Yeah.
that is part of the process?
Yeah, and I think the first thing that we spend as psychologists a lot of time with is dealing with emotions. And
Hmm.
sometimes for a lot of psychologists, it takes a lot of personal therapy to deal with themselves first so that they can work with clients later. And if we think about how we feel about something like failure, depending on how we define it, we may have
Hmm.
our own responses to it that are quite unhealthy or unhelpful. So our own
Mhm.
personal therapy, going to see, another psychologist, allows us to be able to deal with how we feel about it personally as a psychologist, but then professionally. So failure will, of course, depend on how it's defined by the person
Hmm.
and whether it's relative or absolute. So relative
Okay.
failure might be that I have failed on this occasion, but I have opportunity. Whereas some people might say it's absolute. This was my only chance. And life will present lots of dimensions for us to test ourselves, and the dimensions of whether it's achievement or failure or fulfilling a goal or failure that does depend on how we have set that up. And
Mhm.
in terms of failure as a construct, why I was saying that it is information is that for many, many things, we have other opportunities. Sport is a classic example where people say, I can try again next year or next week, or we go to the next competition. And sport is excellent generally, where a lot of people heading for retirement, if you see in their autobiographies, their retirement game may not have ended well, and it's very difficult for them to be able to process that because there's no opportunity to perhaps redeem themselves.
Mm.
So we often talk about failure and redemption. We talk about guilt. We talk about shame. And those are very strong, heavy emotions that weigh athletes down a lot, maybe more than they recognize. So, as psychologists, we spend a lot of our time trying to understand emotion and
Mhm.
how it is interpreted and how it's expressed, how it's processed. And I remember reading about the descriptions of birds fly, fish swim, and people feel. Like most
Yeah.
people will go, what was he thinking? What was she thinking? But I'd be
Yeah.
more inclined to look at what were they feeling,
I see.
because our feelings are really our way of making sense of what's right or wrong in the world for us. It is our own internal system because we don't have another system. Our feelings are
Yeah.
our alarm system in a way, and they're part of that limbic system and allow us to be able to make sense of the world by how we feel.
Yeah. I don't know if you would want to give your personal opinion on it, but in a sense, like, how should we deal with failure? Should we just say that, okay, failure is just a process that did not go well, and kind of,
And
try again?
yeah, and again, like I was saying earlier, a lot of it is the meaning that failure has for us. If
Yeah.
somebody looks at failure and says, I love failing,
Mm.
They love failing because they might say that failure tells me I'm at the edge of my competence just now and I'm learning about how to take the next step. For others, failure might be shameful. I have left myself, my family down. Failure, leaving the team down. Um, Depending on the definition, how a person makes sense of it, and the emotion that comes with it. Now, if we see failure as something that is helpful and guiding and instructive, then we have a way forward. I tried that, that didn't work. I found that out about myself. Wow, I just didn't know that about myself. And while
Yeah.
learning can be painful, it's also quite instructive as well, that it says, I tried that and I learned something. So when we adopt an attitude of exploration and curiosity, we will always continue to keep moving forward because it's an opportunity to again know about ourselves and achieve the things we wish to achieve.
Yeah. No, 100%. Yeah. Yeah. Changing your perspective of how you see failure is probably the first step that we should take
Mhm.
to maybe,
That's right. And just to understand
yeah,
your own perspective, how do I see it?
yeah,
What do I think about? What do I feel? What does it make me feel like inside? And that might change
yeah,
according to context or what you value rather than what's valuable to you, what it is you value. So somebody might
yeah.
fail at, I don't know, 10-pin bowling, but
Mhm.
they may not care about 10-pin bowling, but the fail in a snooker tournament might be wholly demoralizing because of how much that means to them.
Yes, yeah, I understand, and I see what you mean. Because also, like for example, as you say, like in like a sport, we don't care if we fail per se, if we're not good enough. But let's say, for example, if we really believe that we're good in something, or we put a lot of meaning and pressure to ourselves to succeed in something else, our career, let's say for example, like we put a lot of pressure in applying for jobs but not getting the interview, whatever,
Yeah,
and we see that as complete failure. It's like, oh, I'm not good enough for this job. I will lower my expectations and apply for jobs that are pay less, are not, I'm overqualified, and etc.
yeah. And those
Yeah.
are good examples of what you've described there of our attributions, the way in which we make sense of things. And the way in which
Mm.
we make sense of things, of what happened to me, affects
Mhm.
how we are motivated, how we feel, and how we approach things in the future. So having a sensible, reasonable, positive, and supportive outlook about something that happened dramatically influences what you go to do next. And that's why
Yeah.
it's very important that we understand our attributions, the way in which we explain things, whether it's something to do with me, the circumstances,
Mm.
the environment, my development, and so
Yeah.
on. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. Because like the more I do these kind of interviews, I had an interview with relationship coach 2 weeks back. I had with a psychotherapist, and now with yourself. Yeah, I think psychology, under awareness and understanding, yourself, is probably one of the most important things that you can do in your life,
Yeah.
to just understand why you are the way you are, understand yourself and your attributions, like everything, and will massively help you
Yeah.
with every aspect of your life. Fair. So something as well that you have talked, and I took from your TEDx talk, I took quite a few things, is you're talking about direction, and you're giving the example driving a car in a parking lot with fuel but no direction, and driving a car on a highway without fuel. So I would like to ask you, how can we find direction in life, and what should come first, the direction or the fuel?
Yeah. And again, what I was presenting there was quite a simplification of energy and
It
direction
is,
attached
yes.
to motivation. It's a lot more complex than that.
Yeah,
But part
sure.
of what interests us is something we have to find out what interests
Hmm.
us. So we could be curious about something, but we will only generate interest by spending time and learning about what has this got to teach me? What am I learning about myself, others? What's valuable about this? And that is a deepening process. Now, we might say that we're not interested in anything, which may be true, but it's true without exploration. What I mean by that is that unless we test us out our hypothesis, I wonder what is interesting about this. So we spend time exploring. And part of life, of course, sends us down one road and not another. And we can only wonder about how life might have been if we traveled down another. Unfortunately, that's just not how it works. We go down
Yeah.
the road and we learn about ourselves and we can change direction and so on. But part of it, I guess, more than anything, is at present knowing our values, and values based intuition and exploration is worthwhile. Of whether it's loyalty or friendship or discipline or organization or whatever it might mean to you, it's a sense of direction we take. But we might take that with us in several places. It might be into academia, it might be into sport, it might be into business, it might be into family life. So we can be fulfilling in our own way in lots of facets. And I think, if we look through a lot of social media or media in general, there is an orientation about how we can be the better version of ourselves, etc. But that'll be different for everybody. For some, it might be, and spending time with their family. For somebody else, it might be pursuing a business idea and so on. There isn't, I guess, only a person's own sense of direction that matters really, you know.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
of who they are and what they are and what they value is an exploratory tour. It
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like in order to find someone's direction, they need to understand maybe like, what do they care about? What are they interested about? And then kind of like, okay, I'm interested in ABC. Let me see if I can go towards that
Mhm.
point, that goal and etc.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah, no, I do
a
agree.
lot of
Hmm.
privilege in that as well, that we have time and resource and support to be able to do that. There was some research done at University College Dublin, clinical psychologists looking at where they hide the ladder. So people who have been successful talking about their success and maybe the children of those people and how they relate to them. A lot of the time the ladder is hidden. So all of the benefits that allowed them to be successful, that ladder or the ladders, were hidden when they tell the stories about their success. So
Yeah.
we need to be careful when people are telling us the story of the success about those hidden ladders.
Yeah, I think I understand what you mean with that. But then also, like, for example, I don't know, like, I thought of something else that, like, successful people and their kids sometimes do not exceed their parents', success,
Yes,
or they hide behind it.
yes, yeah, of
Yeah.
course.
What do you think is the difference between motivation and discipline? And what should we aim for?
Yeah. And by definition, we are talking about different constructs here, because motivation, if we were to say, take a self determination perspective, it is a theoretical perspective. We might say that within that, we have autonomy, competence, and relatedness, those three facets of that construct. Now, if we were to say discipline might be related to autonomy, or it might be related to competence, I can be disciplined because I know what I'm doing, I'm competent.
Mm.
Or I can be disciplined because I can choose when, or I can be disciplined because of the relatedness, my connection with others. I'm disciplined when others are around me. So whenever we're trying to understand a construct, we have to have a conceptual framework. What is this thing called discipline? And how can it be separated from something like motivation? And what I like to do when we're teaching our uh, trainee doctoral students to become practicing psychologists, we're always trying to create ways of remembering information. And
Mhm.
a simple example of that would be self determination theory, comprising competence, autonomy, and relatedness. And if we take the first letter of each of those words, we get the word car. So, car, and using the example earlier, gives us direction, energy, and direction. And somebody might say that, say, for example, that my team isn't playing so well, they don't seem so motivated. And within the UK, there is a car recovery company called RAC. And the RAC, if you look at car, RAC is the relatedness, the autonomy, and the competence. So when my car
Ah,
breaks down, the RAC will
mhm,
come to help, a bit like a psychologist, and they would look at the relatedness, autonomy, and competence. So we have a way of remembering what is motivation, how it works. So when I
mhm.
have competence, autonomy, and relatedness, I can move and go in the direction that I wish to go when things fall apart. One of those things, or maybe all of those things, are missing.
I see. And where would you say consistency fits in? So, for example, let's say what I wanted to understand with this question is, let's say, for example, my personal belief. Okay, and please correct me if I'm wrong. Right? I think that motivation is not enough. So, let's say I'm motivated to go to the gym, right? And like exercise and build my body. Um, but motivation is not enough. I need discipline to go to the gym, and then I need to be consistent to see the results
Okay.
of going to the gym,
Yeah.
right? So, kind of like, again, maybe you have explained it, but like it's that relation between those three. Like,
Yeah.
in a way, like, is it enough to just have motivation, or do you need the discipline and then also the consistency to see
Yeah.
the results?
Well, if we look at that construct again,
Hmm.
discipline and consistency, if we say consistency will be something that I repeat over time, and
Yeah.
that discipline is that it has a process to it where it's a start and a finish. But all of those things, in a way, are held under that umbrella term of motivation. Because if we are to ask the question, why am I ill disciplined? It'll be something related to motivation. And there are other constructs as well. But why
Hmm.
am I inconsistent? It'll have something related to motivation within it. So when people are saying, I just need to be more disciplined, or I just need, at a at a motivational level, and again, motivation is just one construct, there are many others, but at a
Yeah.
motivational level, we can still understand that. And it's why, and that's what this work of a psychologist is to do, is to understand the specificity of what somebody is seeing, what their meaning is, and the distance between the two of a behavior that I would like to engage in and that I currently am not engaging in. And there are different models for understanding that, like a trans theoretical model or theory of planned behavior. But those models help us to understand what's going on for the person.
Yeah, I see. So basically, we do need motivation per se, because the motivation is the umbrella, right? And then, in order to achieve our goal, we need to keep being disciplined and consistent.
Well,
Is that kind like
yeah, yeah, and it's a bit more complicated than that as well, because we
okay?
there is something known as the COMBI model. It's a behavior change wheel where we can look more specifically at somebody's behavior and the opportunities they have to engage in that behavior and how the environment influences that. There's a lot of layers to it,
Okay.
and it's why that when we work with a psychologist, for the individual to figure out which facet of that behavior change is necessary
I
to
see.
alter, we can make that
Okay.
alteration.
I see. I see. Okay. Yeah. No, I understand.
And one or two
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
to alter. Yeah.
I have a saying that comfort is a dream killer. How do you perceive comfort within the context of sports and performance, and kind of like in the context of life, being comfortable and not stepping out your comfort zone?
Yeah, and a lot of these things, if we would say that they are safety behaviors, ways in which we protect ourselves from the potential pain or harm that we expect or we predict, then
Mm.
something like comfort is telling us something about ourselves, and that'll be all relative. So for somebody, comfort is a 10-mile run, whereas for somebody else, comfort is sitting on the couch. So by
Mm.
definition, it'll be different for everyone. But we would probably go back to more values-based understanding of what is important to you, what matters to you, how do you feel fulfilled, what sense do you get when you do this activity. So we start to break down what might be a personal understanding of something like comfort to more holistic representation of that within their lives. And we might find that, comfort is very different from one person to the next, or by definition, how that person experiences it.
Yeah. So you can say that, like, for example, with the flow state, or for example, like, um, progress happens outside your comfort zone, right? If someone wants to grow, or if someone wants to become like a high achiever, would you say it's important for them to kind of like, be outside their comfort zone?
Yeah, and that's typical. And if we look at the work of Vygotsky, from the 1970s, that work is saying that we need a sufficient challenge. It needs to be a challenge that allows us to engage and figure out a little bit more about ourselves. And if the challenge is too small, we're not interested and engaged. And if it's too far, we tend to withdraw from it. So we're trying to find what is suitable for us. And that's different for everybody. But it's why that individual tailoring is so necessary. We
Yeah,
need to know ourselves and figure out
for sure.
that's okay. It's okay because we will progress as long as we know who we are.
Yeah. And also it's finding that golden ratio, the balance between, like, a goal that is like too kind of close
Right?
to you that
Yeah,
you can easily achieve, and something that's outside you, like
yeah. It's the
very far away, and breaking it down.
Yeah, the Goldilocks principle is about finding,
Goldilocks.
yeah, what is right for each person, which is
Yeah.
different for everybody. Yeah,
In sports, and especially like at the high level of athletes, how can comparing yourself with others negatively affect their mental health, and what are some examples you have seen from your practice when it comes to comparison?
yeah, and comparison, social comparison, again as a construct, means different things to different people. Now, some people are elevated by it, some people are not. It may be that we compare downward, known as downward comparison, and say, I'm just not, at least I'm not as bad as, or we might compare upward, I'm not as good as. But those comparisons are our way of making sense of where we are in the world. And in competitive sport, that's only natural. Now, the
Yeah.
step after that is the meaning we take from that. What does this mean about me? And which relates a lot to our core beliefs and our rules for living. So we're kind of coming back to some of the same construct material again. But fundamentally, we are trying to say, does this comparison support my progression? Or is it
Mhm.
withdrawing energy and direction from my progression? Which might mean a realignment, a reflection, coming to terms with the feelings we're feeling, and so on. That is the work, therapeutic work that we would do.
Yeah. That's interesting. It's funny because it does seem that like majority of these questions, and like, what is it? Why am I comparing myself with others? Of course, it's a social construct, as you said. Like, it's socially we compare ourselves, but it, as you have said kind of a few times now, it's all about like asking that questions internally and trying to understand, okay, how does that make me feel? Like, comparing myself with a friend of mine who's doing financially better, how does that make me feel? And maybe also, why do I have that need to
Yeah,
see it negatively or positively?
yeah, that's right. And again, depending on our values and our experiences, etc., in life, we'll make sense of that comparison in a way that puts us down or puts the other person up, a kind of a double standard, as it were.
Yeah. And I only have a couple more questions, Paul. But another one that I wanted to ask is about ownership, taking ownership and accountability for our actions, and not blaming other people for our failures. So, how do you see ownership and accountability when it comes to like sports, or like, the excuses we give to
Yeah,
ourselves? Oh,
of course.
it's internal politics or something like that.
And a lot of the things that we do, our explanations, our attributions, do relate to protecting our esteem or particular facet or competence within that esteem model. So, for example, if we didn't play well, we may make those attributions about the referee, the conditions, the opposition, and so on. And of course, we're doing that because we want to protect how we see ourselves. And part of that protection then means that it will affect our way forward. Now, on occasion, protecting our self esteem is necessary, but further down the line, the things that we need to address, we may avoid addressing, which is where a lot of people run into trouble. So that we are always trying to adopt an open, non-defensive stance towards feedback. So we can say, okay, let me listen to this. Let me try and make sense of this.
Mm.
What's it trying to tell me? All right, let's see if we can move forward from here.
Yeah, I think ego. I think there's the book from Ryan Holiday. Ego is the enemy.
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And how, for example, like our self-esteem or like, our ego stops us from asking all the questions or seeing a situation kind of like more holistic and, take it kind of positively.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, and
Yeah,
the work we do on ourselves will certainly be worth it.
100%. Paul, before I ask my last question, where can people find you and reach out if they want to learn more
Yeah,
about you?
yeah, I guess. Well, I do two things. I guess I run my own private practice working with athletes, and I also lead a taught doctoral program at Glasgow Caledonian University. So those are the two parts. So one involves working privately with clients, and the other is teaching, research, writing, etc. With those doctoral students. So that's kind of where you find me through the web. And the research and books I publish are usually related to sport and exercise psychology.
No, perfect. I will have all the links below. And my last question, is there anything we have missed? Is there anything that you believe is important when it comes to sports
Yeah.
and performance?
Yeah. Well, the one thing I would say as part of a reflection of our profession is that it does take quite a while to get through undergrad, postgrad, maybe a doctoral training program or an independent training route to become a qualified sport psychologist or sport and exercise psychologist. And within that, the ways that people work may differ, but the standards of practice and ethics are right at its core. And for those people who are out in the field practicing, having been through that training program, etc., they have a standard and quality that they ought to recognize. I'm just saying that as somebody who's been in the field for quite a while, but a standard that they have earned, and that as a profession it's growing and developing its own strengths because it has that lineage behind it. And that means that members of the public who come to see a psychologist, although the psychologist may not fit for them, there will be a psychologist that does. And I think that's important that people keep faith in sports psychology and sports psychology practice, even though their faith in an individual practitioner might be different. And
Hmm.
it's just an encouragement I'd make generally.
Yeah. Did you find also, like in general, like, not only sports and performance psychology, but also therapy in general is positive to anyone?
Oh, yes. And for the most part of the research overwhelmingly presents that it doesn't work for everybody, of course, but overwhelmingly it does. And, even within the change literature, people change again of their own actions, but some need support for that to happen. And that support
Yeah.
shows again tremendously well how talking therapies work. Sports psychology is one of those. And
Yeah.
yeah, the people who are qualified have made the effort to be the best they can as they progress through their careers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, I do agree. It's very interesting because, like, in a very, very small level, I have seen some differences in my awareness by even talking to people. And eventually, I do want to get into therapy. And not only because, like, I had this conversation earlier with a psychotherapist that, not because something is wrong with me, but because I just want to bring more awareness to myself and the way I am, or, why I am the way I am, right?
yeah,
And I think that's positive for anyone to take.
100%. Yeah, and you'll be a better person for yourself and a better
Yeah,
person for others around you.
yeah,
Self-awareness is not just knowing about yourself; it's actually about knowing how you relate to others. And
yeah,
again, personal therapy gives you that's one option, but it gives you an option for exploring that part of us.
yeah. 100%. No, Paul, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was an amazing discussion, honestly. Thank you so much.
No problem. Pleasure. Great to be involved.
Perfect.